All right. Welcome, everybody. Today, you are at JMBE Live. This is a free webinar series hosted by the American Society for Microbiology Education Department, and it promotes the recently published work of authors of the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education. Today, I am your host, Rachel Horak. Our speaker today is Dr. Jeff Maloy at UCLA. He's going to be talking about his recently published paper, and he will give a presentation for the first part of the hour. And then the second part of the hour, we will have lots and lots of time for interactive questions and answers. Take it away, Jeff.
So I'm going to be talking about, as Rachel said, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I've done on promoting growth mindsets and internal loci of control in students. The first thing I want to know, because I know that the JMBE Live series has a very diverse audience, some people who are seasoned pros with education research and some people that are thinking about getting into education research. So I would love to know what all of your backgrounds are with education research. So I'm going to ask you if you could go to menti.com. I'm going to type this in the chat. So it's going to be menti.com and enter the code 14057. And it's going to ask you to just choose an option that best represents your experience in education research. So I'm going to give you, and thank you, Rachel, for repeating that in the chat. I'm going to give you a minute to just go to menti.com and answer this for me so I can get an idea of who I'm talking with. So for those of you who have responded so far, you can see in the results here that we have some people with a lot of experience. And then we also have a big split between people who have some education research experience and a lot of you who are just getting started, which is awesome. I'm really happy to see that. And I'm also really happy to see that because part of how I framed my talk today is to kind of talk with some of you who are interested in getting started about my experience getting started in education research. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my slides here. And I want to start off by giving you just a little bit of background about who I am and how I came into my current position and thinking about education research. So my background, I did my undergraduate at UC San Diego. It was a beautiful place across the street from the ocean, so I could go surfing in between classes, which was great. And then I came up to UCLA and I did a PhD at UCLA in microbiology. This is some of my classmates at UCLA in graduate school, and then the Burkholderia pseudomallei, the bacterium that I studied in grad school. So I did my PhD, kind of traditional bench science microbiology. And I didn't really think too much about education during my PhD, but I did do TAing, like a lot of people do. Most people do some TAing during their graduate school experience. And so I did some TAing, and I discovered as I started TAing that I really enjoyed teaching. And furthermore, something that I really enjoyed was the idea of thinking about teaching like I think about my research, thinking about what's happening in the classroom, how students are responding to things, how I can kind of form hypotheses about my teaching experience and iterate and improve. And so I started to discover that I really enjoyed thinking about teaching as a scientific endeavor. And so after I finished my PhD, I went ahead and I did a non-traditional postdoc. So I did a postdoc at UCLA in the Center for Education, Innovation, and Learning in the Sciences. In SEALS at UCLA, my postdoc kind of taught me to shift from thinking about bench science microbiology to thinking about discipline-based education research. So to start thinking about teaching in the college science classroom and how I could apply kind of scientific questioning skills to what was happening in the classroom with students. And so some of the things that I focused on during my postdoc were questions about motivation and mindset for students, LGBTQ plus student experiences in STEM classrooms at the undergraduate level, and inclusive pedagogy. And so the postdoc was really where I learned to get started in education research I'm an assistant professor of teaching at UCLA. So now what I do is I do a lot of teaching, but I also think about education research and using my classrooms as a laboratory to try out some different things and assess the results. So that's my background. And I also, since we have so many new kind of education researchers and people who are just getting started or maybe have a little bit of experience, I want to kind of frame what I talk with you about today in terms of some tips for getting started in education research. So my first tip here is to start with a theoretical framework. So a lot of times when we as scientists come into a college classroom and we look at education, we kind of think that we're starting from scratch, right? But there's a lot of work that's been done in thinking about how students learn and done by scientists, done by social scientists, done by educators. And there are a lot of frameworks out there that can help us think about different ways in which impacting student experiences might have an effect on outcomes. So these are a couple of examples. The example on the right was actually published in JMBE, and the author listed here, the first author, I believe, is actually in this meeting right now, Katie Cooper. So expectancy value theory, this is one example where we have certain inputs like student expectations of their success in an active learning environment, the perceived value of participating in active learning. So these inputs lead to achievement-related choices in a learning classroom. And so using this theoretical framework can really help to have some idea of how to hang your kind of hypotheses and interventions in a way that should have outcomes, in a way that should have an effect on concrete outcomes. The theoretical framework on the left, this is another kind of a mini subset of a larger theoretical framework on how mindsets impact students' responses to failure. So there are a lot of different models out there about how students experience science classroom, and those models can be a really useful place to start thinking about research questions in the classroom. So the theoretical framework that I use for a lot of my work is called social cognitive career theory. The basic idea of social cognitive career theory, if I'm boiling it down into a single kind of fundamental concept, it's that student academic success and persistence arise from an interplay between self-efficacy beliefs, how much a student believes they can do if they put in effort, outcome expectations, what students expect to get out of their efforts, and interest. And all of those things together lead to academic development. All right, so this kind of understands student success not just as a how smart are you or how much can you achieve, but also how interested are you? How much do you want to achieve in this domain? So to kind of build this kind of the more expanded version of the social cognitive career theory framework, a student comes into a classroom, they're not a blank slate. They have some person inputs, they have gender identity, they have race and ethnicity, they have disabilities. So they have different personal aspects that affect their experience in the classroom. And they also have different backgrounds and environmental influences that also impact their experiences. So those impact their learning experiences, but there are also some different things that can happen in different kinds of classrooms. So students come into these classrooms as different individuals. They have different kinds of learning experiences. And those learning experiences contribute to two things that are really important for student success, self-efficacy. So students' belief that they can do something, that, if I work hard and study, I can learn calculus, as well as their outcome expectations. So students' expectations that if they do this, then something will arise from it, right? So if I study calculus and get an A, then that will further my career goals. So self-efficacy and student outcome expectations are really important because they lead to the development of student interests. A student wouldn't be interested in something if they don't believe they can do it and they don't believe it's going to lead to positive outcomes. So these things lead to the development of student interest. They also affect students' orientations, their actions in the classroom, whether they're oriented towards performing and just getting a grade and proving to people they can do something, or whether they're oriented more towards mastering a domain, right? If they really want to learn something. It impacts students' actions. Do they engage in challenges to try to learn more, or do they avoid challenges? And those things lead to a student's performance. So they impact a student, whether or not a student does well, whether or not they learn, whether or not they persist in a science course in a science career. And then performance, of course, this is an iterative process. So your previous performance is going to lead to different learning experiences in future classrooms, to impacts on your self-efficacy and outcome expectations. So this is kind of a cyclical process here for students. So the social cognitive career theory framework is one that I use in a lot of my work. And I'm going to explain to you how this connects to my work with mindset and locus of control in just a minute here. Before I do, I'm going to go to my second tip. So my second tip for new education researchers is to collaborate and to engage with the students that you're studying. So this picture is a former undergraduate student, Dhiraj Nalapathula. He was a student who was a learning assistant in one of my classes. So we talked a lot about teaching and education together. He got some kind of practical experience trying to work with students and help students understand some difficult concepts, help students to inquire, to think about science in a really inquisitive way. And as Dhiraj was working with me and thinking about education, he noticed some things going on with his peers that led him to ask some questions. All right. And so I think collaborating with people, in particular with people who you're looking to serve and study, can be a really useful way to get started and ask some really salient questions about our student populations. So Dhiraj came to me after he finished being a learning assistant for my class. He came to me and he said, I've noticed some things about students. And also in my experience as a learning assistant, I've learned some things about the ways in which people learn and think. All right. And so I've noticed that students that I interact with have different mindsets. And so the term mindset, when I use this term, I'm referring specifically to growth versus fixed mindsets. And this is an idea that's been studied for a long time. It's come up in kind of pop education literature. So a lot of us, whether or not you're familiar with literature, might have heard these terms before. But basically, a fixed mindset refers to a belief, a self-belief that your personal attributes, such as your intelligence, are fixed and they can't really be changed. I am a smart person. I'm not a smart person. I'm a math person. I'm not a math person. That's an inherent characteristic of me. I can't change that. A growth mindset, on the other hand, is a self-belief where a person says, I'm not a math person yet, but if I work hard and study in my math class, I can become a math person. Right? So a growth mindset reflects a belief that personal attributes such as intelligence can be developed and changed incrementally over time with conscious effort. So at this point, Rachel and I were playing around before you all came in with some screen annotations, and we didn't quite get it figured out. So I can't have you annotate this, but I want to give everybody just kind of 20 seconds here to stop and think about where you might fall personally on this spectrum. Do you identify more with a fixed mindset or more with a growth mindset? No need to take any action. Just want to reflect on this. All right, so keep that in mind as we go on and discuss this. So when we look at social cognitive career theory, again, I said a theoretical framework is a nice way to kind of hang some of your thoughts and hypotheses on. And so looking at social cognitive career theory, growth mindset could have a big impact on some of these things. So for example, self-efficacy. Do I believe that I can do something? Is it yes? Is it no? Or is the answer not yet? But if I put in effort, then yes. Right? So a growth mindset can contribute to self-efficacy, but that's only part of this equation, right? So looking at this theory with Dhiraj, we said, you can impact a student's self-efficacy, but if a student doesn't believe that their effort is going to contribute to positive outcomes, then we're still not going to get where we need to go. So how do we impact students' outcome expectations? Well, Dhiraj and I looked at another kind of concept that sounds similar, but it's a little bit distinct, internal versus external locus of control. So whereas mindset is more about my personal ability and my attributes, locus of control is more about whether or not I have agency over outcomes in my life. So an external locus of control would be, I believe that I have little agency, things happen to me and I respond to them. An internal locus of control would be me saying, I have control over not everything, but over a lot of things that happen to me. I can take action to impact the outcomes that I experience. So again, I'm going to kind of just take 20 seconds here and ask you to reflect on your own feelings about this and whether you identify more with an external or an internal locus of control. All right, so I'm going to give you some examples now of what these combinations of locus of control and mindset might look like for students. All right, so mindset and locus of control, we would predict would be really important for students' approaches to learning and their outcomes in the classroom. Right? Growth mindset can impact a student's self-efficacy. Locus of control can impact a student's expectation about whether or not their efforts are going to lead to a positive outcome. And both of those things together, according to social cognitive career theory, would predict different kinds of actions in the classroom and different kinds of outcomes for students. So I think about these things as kind of two orthogonal, kind of related but distinct concepts for students, locus of control and mindset. So a student could have a growth mindset and an external or internal locus of control, and vice versa. Let's take a look at what that might look like. So here's a quote from students. This might be something for those of you who teach, or for those of you who have been students in your recent history, something that you can relate to, or that sounds like something you've heard from students before. All right, so this quote would reflect a student who has a fixed mindset and an external locus of control. They're saying, the exam is unfair and I don't have the ability to do anything about it. I'm not even a biology person, so I couldn't do anything about it if I tried. That student is not likely to change their actions and approach failure from a positive, productive mindset. Here's another quote. Again, this might look familiar to a lot of you. And so this student has a growth mindset. They're saying, I'm working hard. I'm learning the material really well. I'm improving, but the exams, this thing outside of my control, they're impacting my grade. And I don't have any control over my outcomes, even though I know that I can improve personally. Here's another one. All right, so here we have a student who says, I know that I can change. I know that I could improve. I'm sorry, this one is different. This is a student saying, I know that the exams that are given to me are fair. I know that they're an accurate assessment, but they're accurately assessing that I'm just not a very good biology person. All right, so this student has an internal locus of control. They believe that they could do well on the exams. Everything is there for them, but they have a fixed mindset. So that they have the resources to succeed, but they're just not a biology person. And finally, this is unfortunately a quote that's probably a little less common. So this quote reflects a student who has a growth mindset and an internal locus of control. They say, I didn't do as well as I hoped on this exam, but I just haven't mastered the material yet. If I put in time and effort, there's no challenge I can't overcome. I can do it, and the resources are there for me to achieve what I want to achieve. Now, I'm curious. I just want to take another minute to go to our Menti website. So again, I'm going to enter the menti.com code, so 14057. And if you go to menti.com and enter that code, I'm asking just to hear from you, which of these quotes do you often hear from students? You can select as many answers as you want. So if you hear them all the time, go ahead and select all of them. Select whatever you're used to hearing from students. So we can see as these answers start coming in, that unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of that really productive, positive attitude toward learning, right? We're seeing maybe some students that have a growth mindset and an internal locus of control, but we see a lot of students whose quotes or whose attitudes reflect either an external locus of control or a fixed mindset, or even in many cases, both of these things. All right, so these are kind of some common things that we see with students. And in order to get them to change their behaviors and succeed, we probably need to work on impacting both their mindset and their locus of control. So I'm going to go ahead and flip back to our presentation here. All right. So the research methodology. So Diraj and I, we talked about this a lot. We identified this problem and we found some basis in the literature to maybe try some things to improve, to improve students' expectations and attitudes towards learning. And so we decided to take that information and engage in this action research methodology. So there are different ways of engaging in education research. An action research methodology is a method of engaging in research that's focused on taking an action to address a specific need in the classroom. So in an action research methodology, we might start by identifying the needs of students and identifying resources that are already available and gaps. And then we would design and implement an intervention to kind of fill in some of those gaps and meet some of those needs of students. Collect some student assessment data, analyze that data to determine if we're meeting those needs and filling in those gaps, and then reflect on those results to revise an intervention or revise an action plan to further meet students' needs. So this is a little bit different than what a lot of us are used to maybe as traditional bench scientists, where we form hypotheses and test questions about kind of two objective measures. Here, the idea isn't necessarily to gain some information about an underlying objective epistemological truth about the world, but the outcome is the outcome desired is to make a change in a classroom that has an impact on students. So we used this methodology to develop an intervention we call the Mindset and Locus of Control for Undergraduates in the Sciences, or M-LoCUS for short, to kind of keep some free characters in our written papers and sentences. And we had some student learning outcomes for the intervention. So we wanted students to be able to define and learn about these terms, about mindset and locus of control. We also wanted them to be able to distinguish between those two concepts and reflect on their own approach to learning to adopt a growth mindset and an internal locus of control themselves. All right, so I've kind of abbreviated these learning outcomes, but we developed a set of learning outcomes that we really wanted to implement and have students kind of come away from this intervention with. Which leads me to my third tip for new education researchers: don't reinvent the wheel. So a lot of times there's this urge to create something entirely new, right? And that's a great creative urge. But I also think that it's more productive to identify where there are gaps and where there are resources currently available, and to try to direct our energy towards filling in those gaps. So for example, this intervention, there's a lot that's out there that's available to students on fostering a growth mindset. And so we used some existing available resources. You can go to YouTube and find a lot of really useful videos for teaching students about growth mindsets. And so we went to YouTube, we went to some growth mindset education resources, and we found some resources that already existed. And then we filled in some gaps and found some places where we thought we needed to maybe add some things to enhance the student experience. So this is what our intervention kind of looked like. We had from the beginning of the term to the end of the term. This was all done online outside of class. And the idea is, as an individual instructor, I can do whatever I want in my classroom. But if I really want to impact students across the life sciences curriculum, I can't get all of the instructors teaching these courses to buy in and do all of this stuff in a classroom. And so we tried to develop something that was online, that was kind of a light touch intervention that could have an impact on students, no matter who they had as an instructor. And so what that looked like is 5 intervention points throughout the term. The first intervention point was at the beginning of the term, an initial reflection, where students reflect on previous responses to challenges and setbacks so that they're kind of primed to consider past thought patterns when they start to learn about mindsets and loci of control. Part 2, students become familiarized with growth versus fixed mindsets and reflect on their own mindset. But they also do something that we think is a really important process, where they gain practical experience in modifying fixed mindset thought patterns by advising hypothetical peers through case studies. I'll show you what this looks like in just a minute. I'll show you what it looks like right now. All right. So a case study might look like this. I won't show you the video example right now, just for the sake of time, but the written example would look something like this. So there's a student, Justice, who recently received a disappointing exam score. And so Justice thinks, that exam was really unfair. It didn't test anything about what we learned. And as a result, justice exhibits certain behaviors. So justice decides it's not worth studying anymore. The instructor makes unfair tests. There's nothing they can do to improve. And so we ask students, we present this case after learning about mindsets and loci of control. We present students these cases and we say, what advice would you give justice in this situation based on what you've just learned? And so students would take what they've learned and they'd actually have to apply it, which is actually a really difficult part of this process, is taking that theoretical information and applying it to concrete situations. So we kind of force students to do this through these case studies. We've, since our initial iteration of this, we've since created video examples where actual students talk about their experiences, and we ask the participants to give advice to these actual students who speak to them on video. So students go through this process with growth mindset. Part 3 of the intervention is that they do the same thing, but with locus of control. So they learn about mindsets and locus of control as distinct concepts. And then we have another part to this intervention where students are refreshed about those concepts they've already learned, and they think about how combining them can contribute to positive outcomes for them and positive behavioral changes in the classroom. And then finally, at the end of the term, we ask students to reflect on their experiences and when they exhibited growth versus fixed mindsets in the current term, and how they might change those thought patterns in future terms. So this is kind of the skeleton of the intervention here. And we had a couple of research questions when we employed this intervention. So we asked, did the intervention result in changes in students' mindsets and loci of control? Right? This is something that we think is going to have an impact on students. And our initial obvious question is, did it have an impact on students? And then our second research question, given some of the previous work that's been done with loci of control and mindsets, we know that there are some differences in mindsets and loci of control that different groups of students have. So for example, students who are minoritized students or have minoritized identities, they might be inclined to have more of an external locus of control because they've experienced a lot of things in their life: systemic racism, individual racism, lack of financial resources. So they might have experienced some things that really are beyond their control, that are truly beyond their control, that might impact the way that they come into the classroom and view their ability to change outcomes that they experience. So some of this literature had informed us that different groups of students might have different responses or different kinds of loci of control or mindsets. And so we wanted to know if the changes that we saw between mindset and locus of control before and after this intervention, if they were exhibited by students in different demographic groups. All right, my fourth tip here is to learn from experts. All right, so again, I think a lot of times there's a tendency when we're teaching in a classroom to think that, I'm going to come up with this idea, I'm going to implement this idea, and then somehow I need to figure out how to analyze all of this stuff and what to do with this data on my own. But most campuses, if not all campuses, have some great resources at your fingertips to help you learn how to do some of this stuff. So at UCLA, we have the Center for Advancement of Teaching that actually has a group of educational assessment experts. And so we worked with people at the Center for Advancement of Teaching to help us with some of this data collection. We collected a lot of quantitative and qualitative data, a huge amount of data that really takes a lot of human power to think about analyzing. And so we worked with that team to help us out with this as well. So I'm going to show you some of that data here, just kind of briefly, because I want us to have some time to discuss. So the basic takeaway is that the M-LoCUS intervention actually did succeed in shifting students' self-reported mindsets and loci of control. So on the right here, we're looking at their mindset and locus of control rating, where 1 is going to be a completely growth mindset or a completely internal locus of control, and 10 is going to be a completely fixed mindset or a completely external locus of control. The yellow here is pre-intervention, and the blue is post-intervention. And we can see that students shifted in a positive way towards more of a growth mindset and more of an internal locus of control. On the left side, the bar graphs are just kind of categorizing students. Whereas on the right, we have a whole spectrum of ratings, of self-ratings. On the left, we categorized students as growth, neutral, or fixed mindset, and internal, neutral, external locus of control. And categorically, we saw a shift in students from neutral and fixed mindsets or neutral and external loci of control to growth and internal. These are just tables that they're included as figures in the paper, so you can take a closer look at these tables if you take a look at the paper that Rachel has listed in the chat. She's linked in the chat. And these tables just show some different demographic groups. And the basic takeaway here is that we saw these shifts across demographic groups. So in every demographic group that we tested sex, we tested URM status, underrepresented minority status, we tested first generation status, and we saw across these groups that there was a shift towards having a more growth mindset and more of an internal locus of control from before to after the intervention. I'm going to show you another result, but since we have a lot of kind of new, fresh education researchers here, I know that when I started in education, this was a method of analysis I wasn't as familiar with. So I want to give you a quick idea of what you're about to look at. So one way to look at human subjects, as opposed to something in a petri dish where you can really tightly control a single variable, humans are complex and squishy, and we can't control every variable. So when we think about outcomes for students, we have to think about different inputs that simultaneously affect students' outcomes. So in a linear regression, we might look at a single variable, so an input, X here, and think about how that variable impacts a predicted output, right? So we have a coefficient. This would be the slope of a line in a graph that impacts how much X affects the outcome. In multiple regression, we would just have the same kind of equation, but we have multiple different variables. So for example, maybe we have a student's sex as X1, maybe we have a student's first generation status as XP, and then those different variables have different kinds of impacts. So they have different coefficients that result in differential levels of impacts on an outcome. So when we look at multiple regression results, this beta term is really the important term that we want to know. It tells us how much a single variable impacts an outcome. So this is looking at a couple of standard multiple regression results for pre-intervention mindset rating and locus of control rating. And so actually the outcome here is the shift. So we're looking at what kind of student characteristics impacted whether or not a student shifted in mindset and locus of control from before to after the intervention. So with these tables, kind of the cheating kind of quick way to look at these tables is that this standardized beta value here, this tells us for every unit change in this coefficient, how much our output variable changes. And the p-values here are kind of a quick way to see whether or not these coefficients are significant predictors of our output variable. So at this top table, what we can see is that the only significant predictor of a shift in mindset from pre to post intervention was a student's mindset pre-intervention. All right, their sex, their URM status, their first generation status, none of those things affected how much a student shifted in mindset or locus of control over the course of the intervention. So the intervention was impactful for different groups of students. And this is another way of looking at that. So on the x-axis of these graphs, we're looking at students who started with a growth or a fixed mindset with an internal or an external locus of control. And then we're looking at how much they shifted. So students with more of a fixed mindset or more of an external locus of control shifted in greater magnitudes towards more of an internal locus of control or a growth mindset. Whereas students who started off kind of more neutral didn't shift as much towards a growth mindset or an internal locus of control. So that pre-mindset and locus of control was a big predictor of how much a student would respond to this intervention. And then finally here, this is just showing us that growth mindset and internal locus of control, we kind of expected that these are going to be things that that correlate with other student predictors of success. And so in our hands, we saw that these things did correlate with some different predictors of student success. So growth mindsets and internal loci of control, we're looking at Pearson correlations here. They were associated with greater career motivation, with a greater sense of self-efficacy, and with a greater sense of academic self-confidence in students. And then finally, this is not from the JMBE paper that we've published already, but this is kind of from further work that we've done. We found that post-course growth mindset is a significant predictor of course grades. So if we look at their students' mindsets and students' loci of control, and our output variable here is their grade on a 4-point scale in the class, students who have more of a growth mindset are more likely to do better in the class. And then these are just some acknowledgements. I mentioned a lot of people and the stuff that I've done. I've been very grateful, very lucky to have a lot of really talented and really hardworking and enthusiastic undergraduates, as well as some great resources at UCLA. And so there are 18 minutes left, and I really want to hear from you all and hear some questions that you might have, things that you're thinking about getting into education research, and maybe questions about my experience or questions about the data. I'm happy to answer any of those types of questions that you might have.
Thanks so much. All right, so we have a series of questions from our participants today. I'll start with, I'll just go in order because I think they go in order from your presentation, from the content you presented. So the first one, if you don't know all the theoretical frameworks out there, how do you find them? And where would you find them? Because this attendee is just getting started in this field and hasn't published yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that just as with any kind of new field of research, the first step is to do as much reading as you can and really start to absorb some of what's already been done. And I think that as you look through, for example, papers published in JMBE or papers published in CBE LSE is another great journal to look through some education papers. A lot of those papers start off with a theoretical framework and kind of hang their hypotheses and their results and conclusions on those frameworks. And so a great way to learn about some different frameworks is to just start doing some reading. So if you're interested in, instructor decisions to implement active learning in a classroom, start doing some reading and you'll run into some theoretical frameworks that people use to think about those topics. I think that's the best way to kind of start becoming familiar with different types of theoretical frameworks.
Great, thank you. And I really like how you made a good point of talking about find collaborators and finding people that might be at your institution that know the topic and start to form maybe reading groups together might be a good idea. Is that how you got started as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually, since this is a JMBE Live talk, I also want to say to people who maybe haven't published before or thinking about publishing in education research, that one thing that's great about JMBE is that it's a journal that's very, very supportive of people who are learning how to do some of this stuff. So if you go to the JMBE website, which I'm sure that Rachel will provide some resources, but if you go to the JMBE website, they have kind of some different forms that will guide you through thinking about what kinds of assessment methods you might want to employ. They have people that you can reach out to for feedback on what you're doing. So it's a great site to do some learning. But I think across your campus, collaborators arise naturally from students who know that you're interested in thinking about how education is done. So a lot of students tend to be really interested in this stuff. And again, almost every campus has some kind of an education resource center, and those can be great places to look as well. There's also at UCLA, I know not everyone has this option, but at UCLA and maybe some larger institutions, there's also a graduate school of education here that's a great resource as well to go and find some collaborators or some graduate students who are interested in helping you think about new ways of impacting or changing or asking questions about education.
Thank you. This attendee, I would like to know how our speaker thinks this approach that you presented and this intervention will work for senior students, because I still have fixed and external locus of control in my senior students.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are really interesting topics. Not as much has been done with locus of control as mindset. So if you look through the literature, there's a lot that's been tried with growth mindsets in different kinds of environments, including adult learners and including learners as young as kindergarten. So there's a lot of mindset literature that's been done, that's been published across different kinds of age groups and populations. And we know that it's not just a young learner problem, right? People have fixed mindsets and external loci of control throughout their lives. And actually, it's not something that you can kind of fix once and then it's fixed forever. It's a constant thing to think about and struggle with and improve. And so I think that there's a good chance that doing something with senior students where you kind of explicitly remind them about these concepts, or maybe teach them about these concepts for the first time, and teach them that, hey, this isn't just something that I think, this is something that we can look at data. There's a lot that's been done. We know that making these changes can impact your outcomes. I think introducing that to more senior students can really be impactful as well. That's been done with different kinds of with weight loss and with medical management and mindsets and loci of control. So this has been different kinds of experiments have been done with these concepts in really different settings.
Thank you. Tendi asks, did students self-rate using a scale that was fixed versus growth? Or were they given statements and asked to rate how much they agreed with the statement?
Sorry, can you repeat that, the beginning part of that again, Rachel?
For your survey work, did the students self-rate using a scale that was fixed versus growth? Or were they given statements and asked to rate how much they agreed with certain statements?
So we've done both. And actually, we've found surprisingly that students are pretty good at evaluating at self-rating. So those results, those self-rating results actually line up pretty well with survey results with multiple items where we assign a growth versus fixed mindset score for students. So they're pretty good at rating themselves. When students rate themselves, those results, I think, tend to be a little bit more nuanced. So we've got a preference to maybe trust students a little bit more with their self-ratings, but we have done both and they both appear to work.
Thank you. Okay, next question. What if you used something like normalized gain rather than absolute gain on the scale? In other words, how much students gained out of maximum possible gain to avoid ceiling effects?
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And obviously, that's not the way that we did that analysis, but looking at a normalized gain would be a great way to do that, because there clearly is a ceiling effect, right? Where students who start off with a really growth mindset don't have anywhere to go. So that is a fantastic suggestion.
How much time did students spend on the interventions?
Yeah, so this is actually something, if you are interested in this and maybe thinking about implementing this, or if you're interested in looking at how this was developed, the paper that we published in JMBE, we spent quite a bit of effort trying to kind of give our justification for making different decisions in developing the intervention. So there's a lot of time spent on how we developed the intervention. One thing that was really important when we developed the intervention was to think about what we could get away with, what we could do that we could get other instructors to implement in their classes. And so there's this concept of something called a WISE intervention, or a light touch intervention. And the idea is that when you have very specific psychological targets, things that you specifically want to impact in students, so some small targeted ideas, you can actually have a pretty big impact on some of those things without spending too much time. So versus some maybe bigger, kind of more amorphous concepts, if you have a specific growth mindset, fixed mindset, you can actually give students a very targeted intervention and have an outsized impact. And so students don't spend much time on these interventions. There are 5 contact points throughout the term. All 5 contact points occur online, and each one takes maybe 20 minutes for students. So it's small amounts of time at regular intervals throughout the term. And that is sufficient to have at least a near-term impact. We haven't followed up yet longitudinally, but at least in the near term, that small amount of time is enough.
That's great to hear. You're not sacrificing too much content or in-class time. That's already valuable.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a big concern with instructors when we think about when we go to people and say, hey, try this in your classroom, is that people say, I'm already trying a bunch of stuff and I have a million people coming to me with different kinds of things they want me to try. And so having something that's kind of precise and surgical like that can really have an outsized impact.
Next question. Did you get students to participate or sign up for this since it wasn't done in specific courses?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this actually was done in specific courses. It was done throughout our introductory life sciences series at UCLA. That was to start. We've since expanded this to some different courses and even to some different institutions. So, but our initial kind of rollout was in we have a 3-course introductory life science series at UCLA. And so our initial rollout was in that 3-course series for all students in this series. So there were 8 instructors, I believe 8 or 9 instructors across those different classes. And because it was kind of a light touch intervention and didn't require anything of instructors really, other than putting something on their website, we were able to get all of the different instructors for the intro classes to participate.
Okay. Next question. And again, if you have other questions, we have time for another question or two, and you can either send me a direct message or send it to the chat.
Rachel, sorry, can I real quick? I realized I didn't answer part of that question before. So before we ask the next question, how did we get students to participate? So I told you how we got instructors to participate. How we got students to participate was we actually incentivized it. So we gave students, initially it was some extra credit for participating. Now it's become a part of the course. And so students get points for different kinds of reflection things throughout the quarter. And these are just things that we give students a small amount of points in the course, but for those of you who teach introductory first-year students, you know that small amounts of points can be really, really motivating for students. So we actually kind of incentivize them with points to participate.
Excellent. Okay. I'm using the underrepresentation curriculum. It's a curriculum on underrep.com. I haven't heard of it myself, but I'm going to go look it up. And part of that is busting the myth of meritocracy, which is acknowledging the real external factors that impact success. We're not even starting on an even playing field. This seems like helping students shift toward an external locus of control in a healthy way. How do we reconcile this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a big thing that comes up. And there's actually been some literature that has been critical of some of the ways in which growth mindsets are portrayed as kind of panaceas. Because there's a tendency, if you're not careful with it, to think, to kind of fall into that meritocracy way of thinking about things, and so I think that there's a balance. It's one that we explicitly address with students. So when we teach students about loci of control, we explicitly say to students, hey, there are things that you don't have control over. We talk about structural racism, right? We talk about some of these things that students may have experienced that they can't control. But the shift isn't to say that all is my fault. The shift is to say, what are the things that I can do in my current situation to kind of to move forward and have a positive impact on things that are happening to me right now in the classroom, right? So for example, and some of our case studies also reflect this, but for example, maybe a student they missed class one day because they had a family situation happening and they had to take care of their younger siblings, and there was really nothing they could do about it, right? So that's not something the student shouldn't say, well, it was my fault and I'm a bad person and can't achieve anything in biology because I should have done something differently. But from that point, the student can say, what can I do? What agency do I have to now move forward from that situation? So maybe that means I can take control of my situation by going to office hours to try to make up for some of that material that I missed, right? Or maybe I can practice some more at home. So the question, the focus isn't on, making the assumption that everything that happens to you is in your control, but the focus is saying, what can I control and what can I do to move forward within the framework of my life that exists around me?
Last few questions. Would you be able to comment, how would you adapt this for kindergarten?
That's a great question. So I think that there are really different things that you can do with mindsets and loci of control at different levels. So, for example, in an undergraduate biology classroom, this was implemented specifically for scientists. And so we focus a lot on, for example, neurobiology. There's some stuff we know about the neuroscience of different mindsets. And so we kind of focus on some of those modules in our classes. Those obviously wouldn't be as appropriate for a kindergarten audience, but there are certain different ways that you can approach these concepts and start to teach people to think with these thought patterns at earlier time points. So one example, when people talk about more kind of child development and growth mindsets, is people say, praise not the outcome, but the effort for a child who's trying to learn something. So instead of saying, you did a great job with that drawing, you might say, you put in a lot of effort and that effort really paid off, right? So instead of saying, you're such a talented, you are such a math person because you got this arithmetic question right, you might say, wow, you really worked hard and learned, and that has paid off and you've done well here. And so kind of instilling those thought patterns more implicitly early on is probably a more effective way of doing this for earlier learners.
That's great. I have small children myself, and I'm going to start using that kind of verbiage. I think all the other parents out there are thinking the same. Okay,
it's
so we'll have time
for students too. It's something that I really tried to consciously focus on changing when I interact with students. It's hard, it takes effort, but I think it's worth it.
Excellent. We have time for one more question, and then we'll have to wrap up. Were you able to assess whether students adopted the new mindset and locus of control? And this is a really important question, I think.
So to assess whether they adopted it, yeah. So we looked at their responses to survey items and their self-ratings of their mindset and locus of control at the end of the study. And so based on those measures, we saw a change in students' mindsets and loci of control. We also collected some qualitative data, and that qualitative data is not presented in the initial paper that we published in JMBE. It will likely be followed up on, and you'll see it come out at some point. But we did some student interviews and collected a lot of qualitative free response data from students to kind of get some insights into how they viewed learning, their attitudes toward learning. And we're also seeing, as we go through that data, we're seeing some changes in the way that students describe approaching challenges. So in that sense, we did see changes from before and after doing this intervention. Again, I think there are some really interesting questions here. So longitudinally, we don't know how long those changes last. We also haven't yet, although we're starting to collect this data, we haven't yet determined exactly what effects that those might have on student performance at different time points. So we're collecting a lot more of this data, and this is kind of the action research. It's a lot of iteration, it's a lot of asking new questions, and it's an ongoing process.
Thank you so much.